was born in Shadyside. Family moved to Mount Lebanon when I was 13, just finishing elementary school, and I went to high school and college from there.
And when did you graduate from Mount Lebanon?
I graduated from South Hills Catholic High School in '61, second graduating class.
In 1961.
Yeah, and then I was a commuter to Duquesne.
And did you know even then that you wanted to be a movie critic or write about movies or reporter?
When I was in the first grade at Sacred Heart Elementary School, Shadyside, East Liberty, I had a homeroom nun named Sister Mary Antonine. And partway through the first grade, she asked each of the children to stand up and say what they wanted to do for a living. And this was 1949, 1950. And so the responses were not only of that time, but very gender specific. And all the little girls in the class were saying, I want to be a school teacher, I want to be a homemaker, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a nun. And the little boys, depending on whether they were coming down from the wealthier ends of the parish, Squirrel Hill, those boys had fathers who were doctors and lawyers, and that's exactly what they wanted to be. And most of the rest were saying, I want to be a policeman, I want to be a fireman. And the kids would pop out of their seats just long enough to say, fireman, and even hanging on to the desks as they popped up and down. And I happened to be seated, I'll never forget this, in the last seat in the third row. So by the time it got to me, 60% of the children in the class had already said what they wanted to do, and they were all these stock answers, and I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, you're 6, you should know, shouldn't you? So I popped up and I said, I want to be the next drama editor at the Pittsburgh Press. And I sat back down, and it was the first time I saw Sister Mary Antonine crack a smile all year. And the whole process stopped while every kid in the other rows turned around to look at this weird kid who had made this declaration. And I absolutely believe that if I had not been so fixated on a single specific thing all those years, it wouldn't have worked out the same way. Because knowing exactly what I wanted to do made all of the difference in focusing all those years till I got there.
How in the world did you know at age 6 that that's the job that you wanted? How did you know even such a job existed?
I couldn't have put it in these words then, but I wanted to be the person who had an opinion of record about something I was already so focused on, which was film. And later, we added theater to that.
What's the first film that you remember seeing and really responding to?
I can never remember which came first, but the first 2 movies I can remember being taken to in the late 40s were the re-release of Disney's Pinocchio and the re-release of The Wizard of Oz. They both came back around 1948, and I was taken to see them, and they must have impressed me because I sure got hooked. And except for going to Kennywood or Westview, there was no greater treat for me than to be taken to the movies. So much the better if it was a double feature, because then I got 2 in for one ask or one take.
And that remained with you as you grew through high school?
Never
you went
changed.
to movies all the time?
Never changed.
Do you remember, this is jumping ahead maybe a little bit, but I wonder if the movies perhaps gave you an impression of what Army life would be like?
It absolutely did. And the one war films were not a favorite genre of mine, because there was only so much I could relate to as a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 10-year-old. But the one that knocked my socks off in the very beginning, and I saw a second time a couple weeks later, was From Here to Eternity, which to this day is one of my all-time 10 favorites. And I was totally taken in by the character of Robert E. Lee Pruitt, the guy played by Montgomery Clift. He was the first person I can remember identifying as somebody I would want to be like when I grew up.
And you have such a different array of characters within the Army. You know, the bullies, the kind of sensitive one, the very good sergeant. Did you run across these kind of characters when you were in the Army later?
I think I probably thought in terms of them as variations on themes that were familiar from a lot of movies. But that was the one that impressed me the most and remains so.
Well, when you graduated high school, there was a draft. And so you must have known growing up that, as a young man, you were going to serve in the military.
Listen, I have 2 older sisters and 2 older brothers, and the brothers are 13 years older than I and 9 years older than I. They were more like uncles to me. And I'd followed them right along the line through Sacred Heart School, through the Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts, and there was no question that when I got to college, I was going to be going into ROTC just as they had. So I did that at Duquesne, and so I went in with a commission.
And what was the ROTC program like at Duquesne?
Everybody, all the males had to take the first 2 years, as I recall. And then there was a selection process. First of all, a minority even wanted to go through the whole 4 years. And then 30 were selected to go through the program the junior, senior years and follow through on getting commissioned at the end of the line. And graduating was one of the conditions of getting a commission.
And you wanted all 4 years? That's something you wanted?
Oh yeah, it was preordained. It was what I was going to do because it was what we did. So it's like you have 16 years of school and then you do 2 years in the service, and that was the norm. I never questioned that.
Can you tell us what the ROTC training was like, and did you like it? I mean, did you go to 2-week camp, or how did it work?
I think today we look at things differently because every kid is making all kinds of choices for himself. That's quite different from the way it was for me. I was on an 18-year track, and it was going to play out this way, and when all of that was finished, I could get on with my life and my profession. It wasn't about making those choices, just as going to Duquesne was not going to be a choice. It was a school I could commute to, and it was a Catholic college here in Pittsburgh, and that was it. That's the way it was going to be. We didn't challenge these things. We accepted the way it was and made the best of it. And
did you have to do basic training with ROTC?
no, what happens is when you're in ROTC, the summer between your junior year and your senior year, back in those days, we went to Indiantown Gap in the eastern part of the state, and that was our version of basic training. And it was the last, I always thought of it as the last shot the NCOs would get at the future officers before they got commissioned. And during our time there, we would all have a minimum of 4 days when we had a specific task at a specific rank. You might be a general or a colonel one of those 4 days. You'd be a platoon sergeant another day. You move through all of the possibilities, trying you out at this rank or that rank.
That's interesting. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, and it seemed to me it was once a week you'd hit one of these, and I guess it began the second week. I'm not sure about that, but it was an intensive period, as anyone who's been through basic training would know. They just, you're pushed to the limit in terms of running and no time to yourselves, and it's odd. I've always had a very strong temporal sense. At any time during a movie, I will say to myself, I think it's 9:13, because I just have this sense that 63 minutes have passed or whatever. And when I was in the Army, when I was in basic training, the ROTC summer camp, I knew exactly how many hours it was till this would end. And during the day and each night, I would be ticking off the hours, and the numbers getting smaller. And you're sleeping in barracks that are packed to the gills with all the guys who are in the same position, and you're sleeping head to foot to prevent spinal meningitis, and and you hear these guy sounds all night, every night, the snoring and the bunks are creaking and there's somebody up above you or beneath you. And I thought, man, I can't wait till this is finished and I'm back home. And the first night I was back in my own bed in my folks' home in Mount Lebanon, I thought, oh, geez, it's so lonely here. Everybody's gone home, because there were very positive sides. And that was my first experience at realizing whatever's going on, however bad you think it is, you're bonding. People are mattering more to you than they ever did when you were in the classroom. You're working to achieve goals together. And that was my first experience of that, and that mattered.
That was beautifully put.
Thank you.
I'm not a veteran, and so I've always been curious about that people's time in the service means so much to them, often without regard to whether they liked it or didn't like it, or they were in danger or not. And that, I think that maybe expresses why that time means so much.
And when you go into a war, you're not really thinking about who you're going to lose, what friends or bunkmates or whatever, and then you find out that somebody's gone, and you have a different sense of the vulnerability we all have. You never know when somebody's, here in Pittsburgh, you never know when somebody's going to be taken in an auto accident or is going to be gone from cancer in 50 days, which a very close friend of mine was. You realize how day to day it is, and I think it gives you an appreciation for how vulnerable we all are, and that life may be taken away in a moment.
Did that happen to you? Somebody you were fairly close with?
Yeah, my mentor in the Army did not come back. He was a captain who took me under wing, and I even had Thanksgiving dinner with him at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and I met his wife, who was a pure Grace Kelly type. I mean, I thought, oh, geez, Mr. Gung Ho here is married to Grace Kelly, and he was very, very. He wanted to get into the war. I mean, there were guys like that. He wanted to get over there and do something, and we did not go over as part of the same unit. I went over with the 40th Signal Battalion, and sometime later, while I was still over there, I ran into our old first sergeant, and he said, "Did you hear what happened to the captain? He was in a helicopter and he was shot down and he stuck in a tree, and just an awful finish for a great guy." August 15th, 1965, went to Fort Gordon, Georgia. The first 9 weeks was training school for officers newly on duty in the Signal Corps, and then we were assigned to units, and that's when I made my way to this particular battalion and company that this captain was at. And eventually I was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana, to join the 40th Signal Battalion, went over with them, and halfway through that year, we learned that half of the battalion had to be disseminated among the other battalions in Vietnam, because otherwise the whole 40th would be due to come back at the same time 12 months later. So half of the troops went elsewhere, and 3 of the 5 officers went elsewhere, and that included me. And that's when I joined the 267th Signal Battalion.
Could you tell us what you did with the Signal Battalion? What was your job?
Yeah, it was a pole line company. So our job was to go into areas which had been cleared, but where there was no communications yet. And our job was to set up the communications so the rest of the military could move in and be all set up. So we would erect telephone poles and string cable on them, or we would dig ditches which were 5 or 6 feet deep, V-shaped ditches, And we would bury the cable in those and then cover them over again. And we'd just go out on jobs for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, pitch tents and eat whatever mess was provided. And I was always aware of the lack of creature comforts, which is to say that because we were not actively engaged in war, you're not so much concerned about being shelled, for example, or shot at, as coping with the day-to-day issues of rats and shrews, scorpions, red ants, palmetto bugs, which of course we have here in the United States too, but you know, the giant cockroaches, which are always running out from under whatever, you know, you pick up your baseball cap or your helmet, and there's just was always something darting out that had been using that for cover. And I can remember, I think it was the first or the second night, I was in this cot, you know, we slept on cots, and you always had mosquito netting around it because the mosquitoes were so bad over there, especially during the monsoon. And I couldn't figure out what to do with my alarm clock because, of course, I'm completely tucked into this thing, and and the alarm went off at whatever 5:30 the next morning, and I'm looking up at the mosquito netting on me, and there's a couple of shrews running around up there, and I thought, man, this place is infested. But I can tell you when the troop ship. It took us 18 days to get over there, 17 of travel, and one night layover in Subic Bay. And when the troop ship got within sight of Qui Nhon, which is where I was going to be based with the 40th Signal Battalion, I happened to be running movies on the ship at that time. I was the entertainment director on the ship. And somebody, I think the door of the little auditorium popped open and somebody said, "You can see it." And everybody watching the film at that moment jumped up out of their seats and ran outside. And we could see the shore of Qui Nhon. And the first thing that struck me was, and we were some distance out, we were probably a mile or two away from the shore. The first thing that struck me was the stench, because there's so much livestock just wandering around in Vietnam. The odor is so pungent. Now, of course, you get used to that, as in a latrine or any other situation. But it was so strong, and of course it got stronger and stronger as we moved toward the shore, and you just adjust to it after the time. But we were all entitled to 5 days of R&R. And I deliberately saved mine to the very end. I mean, there were guys who were ready to take it a month after they got there.
5 days for the whole year, R&R?
Yeah, 5 days. And I saved mine to the very end, you know, except for a week of out processing. I made it like the 51st week that I was over there. And I went to Penang, Malaysia, because it was the cheapest place you could go. And at this point, I wanted to get home. I didn't care about Malaysia. And I remember when I came back, and it was on some very small aircraft, when the door opened again and I was back at wherever I had been delivered to, Song Bay or whatever, it hit me all over again. And I thought, I hadn't even thought about that the whole year I was there, because it was so pungent all the time. But as soon as that airline door opened and I was ready to step out, it hit me again, as it had almost a year before.
You commanded how many men?
Well, in Fort Gordon, where I had my own company, there were 500 and some, because it happened to be a company where once they finished their advanced individual training, they'd get stuck there waiting for orders, and most of them were going to go to Vietnam. But in real circumstances, as I remember, the company had 240 men, of which I had 60, I guess. I haven't thought about those numbers in a long time.
4 platoons in a company.
Yeah, and And there were some men in the platoon, of course, I used when I thought a job was extra challenging and only 10 of us were going to go or whatever. But
So you had your crew of guys you could really trust who were really good.
yeah, you know in time which ones, as you know, as in running a baseball team or anything else, you get a sense of who has the strengths and in what areas, and you use them when something is vital or something needs to be done extra quickly or very efficiently.
Was it tough? I guess I'm trying to ask you this in a sense that, again, I think there's a generational issue here. You're 22 years old and you're commanding 60 men. That seems awfully young. That seems like a lot of responsibility. That seems like a tough job. Did you take to it? Did you dislike it? Or was it just something you did because you were told to do it?
It simply was the next thing in the order of the things I had to do before I would start to run my own life, and there were ways. And look, I was a book person. I was an English and philosophy major, and a psych minor. None of this came naturally to me, so I always felt it was a question of getting up to speed. I remember when I learned about the various parts of the Signal Corps, and they were breaking it down. I forget how many different kinds of signal people there were, but when all of these various groups were described, the pole linemen were described to me as just generally probably the least educated, the hardest workers, and the hardest players, and I thought, well, that's that's probably where I'll wind up. It just, and sure enough, that's what I got, and I remember when we were all being trained to do certain things over there. There was the day when we were shown a pole. There was a tall phone pole in front of us, and we all had this foot gear on, and we're learning about climbing phone poles, and I thought, oh boy, this will be, and I can't afford to look foolish doing this. So only so many could try it the first day because there was a lot of other instruction involved, and I knew exactly what was going to happen. Immediately after dinner, I put the equipment back on and I stared at that pole, and like somebody going to bat in the bottom of the ninth, I thought, I got to do this, and I took that extra moment and I went right up the pole. I astounded myself. You don't know what you can do sometimes until that have-to moment, and I went up there. And I'm not sure I thought about this in advance, but once I got to the top, and I was all alone, I don't think anybody was around, I thought, oh, what's the part about coming back down? Because it's a whole different process of pulling your leg up and moving it down the extra foot as you work your way down the pole. But I am telling you, when I got down there, I felt 1,000% better because I did it on the first try, and I'm going to be having to do it a lot from now on, so that was it. And that was fine. But I had the advantage of holding back until that evening, and then I could do it privately. So it went okay.
You reported to Fort Gordon probably 2 or 3 weeks after President Lyndon Johnson made an announcement that we were going to go to war in a big way in Vietnam. He had been holding back that decision, and he ordered an immediate call-up of 100,000 or 150,000 over, and then the draft notices started going out at a really rapid clip, and so you were there during the rapid buildup. Did you have any thoughts about this war? I mean, could you have found Vietnam on a map when you graduated Duquesne? Were you aware that this war was coming?
Yes, I think so, especially being part of the 4-year ROTC program. I could not have, and also the fact that I was so entrenched in my ideas of getting into the media as soon as I came back out there were kind of parallel factors in the fact I was paying some attention.
So you were paying some attention to this growing
Yeah.
war in Vietnam. Did you have any thoughts or feelings about it?
Well, I sure did, in that unlike now with everything going on in the Middle East, something that characterized the Vietnam War is that it was the first highly unpopular war that the U.S. was involved in, that Americans had opinions about. As far as I was concerned, and I got to think that a lot of other guys felt the same way, as far as I was concerned, this was like World War I and World War II, and all those war films I'd seen and all the training I'd had, that you simply did what you were told to do. Korea was like that too, but it was a lower profile war than World War II. And what I think I was unprepared for at the time, excuse me, was Jane Fonda and all of the protest leaders railing and rallying against us while we were doing what we thought was simply the same responsibility as the guys in Korea and the world wars. That was confounding and extremely frustrating. And we saw this playing out. I was getting the Pittsburgh Press and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette delivered to me the whole time I was in the service.
Even in Vietnam, you were getting copies of the Pittsburgh Press?
Always, except that whereas they would catch up with me 3 or 4 days later when I was in Georgia or Louisiana, they would arrive in sacks, like Santa Claus sacks, bundles and bundles at a time when I was over there. And any time I was back in camp, my complete commitment to catching up was reading those newspapers in sequence. And of course, we knew the protests were going on, and they just built and built and built as the war progressed. And it was incomprehensible that this was happening, because you could have fruit thrown at you. I found it a very an unprecedented low point in American history. And one of the things that was corrected in the decades that followed was that none of the vitriol was directed at the military members themselves. They were restored to a kind of hero stature, but that simply was not the case during the Vietnam War. I remember once I was into my profession involving film and theater, and Jane Fonda came to Pittsburgh, and she spoke at what I knew as the old Shenley Hotel on the Pitt campus. It's now, I think, a dorm. She spoke there, and I stood in the back of the class, and then I was part of a group of about 5 reporters to go into an office with her after. I remember the other people in that press conference sucking up mightily. And of course, I was very much aware that this was the highest profile protester in the United States. It's certainly not just against me, but against everybody who lost his life, everybody. And I first made the decision I wasn't going to get into that. I mean, there was no practical way I could do that, and certainly not in this environment where all this sucking up was going on. And I asked her some pointed career questions, and I had a very unusual experience. I don't think it ever happened before or since in my life. I was the one who knew what the films coming up were, and I'd seen everything she'd ever done. And I asked her some specific stuff that I would have known from my access to information about careers and so on. And she said in front of the others, and she didn't know me from, there was no differentiating the movie critic in the crowd from the other reporters. And she said, "Oh, you really know what you're talking about." And that was peculiar in that it created in me an involuntary dissolving of, there was an ego factor there that she had deliberately played on. But it disarmed me for just that moment when I thought, oh, geez, Jane Fonda says I know what I'm talking about. But it never changed my attitude to what she was doing. The shot of her sitting on the cannon and, mounting the cannon in Hanoi, and I can understand why when she made some reconciliatory gesture about 10 years ago, I'm guessing, and the VFW or the American Legion or somebody said, "We will not forget," and I thought, damn right.
What was coming home like? I mean, were you dismayed by coming home? And as so many Vietnam vets have talked about, kind of being careful to not wear your uniform and that kind of stuff. Did you get any of those instructions?
No. As a matter of fact, when I was discharged, which happened to be from Fort Dix, New Jersey, I think it was after I landed there that it occurred to me, I'm going to be getting a job, and I didn't know how easy or hard that was going to be. And I'm not going to have a vacation for a while. So I went straight to New York with nothing but a couple of uniforms, and I spent 9 solid days seeing Broadway shows and every movie I could cram in from 8:30 a.m. until past midnight. I mean, I had a year's worth of catching up to do, and I'm living out of a duffel bag. And so I had the uniform on all that time. That was simply all I had in the way of clothing. And I got no reaction from New Yorkers. I don't remember anything, except I was always buying tickets in the back row of the balcony. And one time at a Wednesday matinee for the musical Mame, which was still new at the time, an elderly usherette whose son was on active duty, I shouldn't say elderly, she seemed older to me, she was probably in her 50s, and she came up to the top row where I was sitting in my uniform, and she said, "Listen, all the seats aren't going to be sold today because Angela Lansbury is out sick. So you come down here, as soon as the lights go down, I'll signal you and you come down." And she put me in a better seat in the mezzanine. And that was the only experience I remember relating to my uniform when I was there. The thing that struck me most when I got home, and I honestly didn't think about this at all until years later, when I was a guest speaker in a class at Point Park College, and the subject came up. I hadn't missed the fact that when I got home, nobody, not family, not friends, not former classmates, not neighbors, nobody asked me anything. And in retrospect, I thought, man, I knew we wanted to put this war aside, but wasn't anybody curious about the very things we're talking about today? I mean, I wasn't going to bombard them with information about weapons and vehicles and places they would never have heard of anyway. And another thing that struck me was I was driving to work one day at the Pittsburgh Press, and I was listening to a very well-known newscaster, and I don't mean Bill Burns, who was on KDK TV, but I was listening to somebody on the radio who was very well established as a newscaster, and he was mangling the most routine words in reference to Vietnam and a couple of generals and so on. And I thought, man, can't you sit down one night and listen to Walter Cronkite and get the basic pronunciations down, because this is a disgrace.
Why do you think people didn't ask you about it? I find that so odd.
I think they just didn't want to know. And remember, unlike during World War II, there were tons of movies coming out. I mean, week after week after week, Bataan, and there were just so many of them. Because the world wanted some kind of a view, if even a Hollywoodized view of what was going on in Germany or in Japan or wherever we were, Italy, France. They wanted some perception of what Johnny's going through. And there were not any Vietnam War movies. In fact, the few that were released shortly afterwards were minor ones that nobody was seeing, like Go Tell the Spartans. And it was not until 1978 that we got The Deer Hunter and Coming Home, which were the two front runners for all the awards, and Deer Hunter got more of them. I think probably the first and the strongest thing I thought was, what a waste. If I never have given up the belief that if we had handled Vietnam the way we had handled other wars, we could have won quickly and easily. It didn't make any sense that we didn't, and we had the manpower to do it. It was always as if we were straitjacketed, and when I thought of the people I knew who had died, whose whole families were forever changed by this, it just seemed an awful waste. Don't get into this again if you're not committed to win it.
Do you care to talk about anybody you knew who did die in that war, apart from the captain, your mentor?
Well, the other one was not somebody who died over there, but there was somebody I dated whose brother came back, and I'm not even sure I saw him after he came back. I think I might have. But he was a person who was psychologically ruined by the experience, and he took his own life. But in film after film after film about people coming back from Vietnam, there were always these scenes with a guy sleeping with a pistol under his pillow or a rifle in his bed, and greatly psychologically damaged by the experience. And finally, when you've seen this enough times, you think this is out of proportion to what happened. Most of us came back and went on with our lives, just that nobody gave a damn. Nobody wanted to hear about it. And that was okay. I was so fixated on getting into my line of work and progressing there that was just something that happened. And I'm not sorry it happened to me, because I escaped intact from the experience. I came back when my time was up, and that was it, and it was never going to happen again. And I always felt, I unquestionably, I was changed by the experience, but it was an invisible change. Only I knew something had happened. I can remember a friend of mine, a close friend I'd gone through high school and college with, who used to be hugely amused that I could get a whole hamburger in at once. And cheeks all puffed up. And I'm sure I did this once or twice in front of him. He thought it was a riot. And when I came back, at some point in some public situation, he asked me to do it again. And I think that was the first time I flat out indicated, that's not where I am anymore. I'm not going to do that to amuse you anymore. It's just a small thing.
So it's kind of a sobering, maturing experience.
Yeah, well, inevitably you're changed, and you can't even guess it, the ways in which you're changed. But you go through an experience like that where you're completely isolated from real life for 12 months. Something's going to happen. So, I looked the same, I sounded the same. I still wanted to get into writing about movies and theater, and so to the rest of the world, I just was missing for a while. I was some kid you didn't see for a while. Well, yeah, I'm still a variation on myself, but my feeling, and this may have seemed patronizing or paternalistic, was we were in South Vietnam for the purpose of helping, if not rescuing, the South Vietnamese from the perils of the North Vietnamese and communism. And you know, we had clothing, we had food, we could function, we had vehicles, and I'd never seen poverty like that before. I mean, nothing I've ever seen in the United States, you know, and I hear griping, and you do. I think you don't have a clue what real poverty is. Real poverty is, and these people with their little bitty shops, you know, the guy clipping hair with scissors, and the poverty was so extreme, and these animals are just running around, the livestock, the chickens and the dogs, and it just everything just running around loose, because there was no such thing as property that I saw. And I felt so sorry for them. I mean, that's a patronizing attitude, but I'd never seen anything like that. And I thought, my God, even if we win this thing and win it quickly, what's going to become of these people? It was awful. They had nothing. Yeah, I sent one thing home to my folks, I think right after I got there, a big color map of Vietnam, kind of color-coded, you know, according to the sections. And I saw it when I got home. In fact, they'd saved letters and stuff too, but I've not seen that stuff since, I think. And but the one thing I wound up with, the only souvenir, and I've seen all those war movies in which someone brought home a Luger from Stuttgart or whatever, but all I wound up with was this massive pair of scissors, and it wasn't designed as a souvenir of my 2 years in the Army, but I took these with me wherever I went because I always had paperwork to do, and you know, we didn't have copiers or anything like that. We were really roughing it in a sense. And so as long as I had these scissors, I could clip up whatever I needed to. and can you imagine today trying to board a plane, much less go from Vietnam to Japan to New Jersey to New York and back to Pittsburgh, and you have this in your duffel bag. But I keep them on, but they're beside my computer all the time, my desktop. And whenever I need to be clipping apart some stuff I've copied off the computer or whatever, this is what I use. So when you ask me if I had any souvenirs, well, I'm sorry, but this is it. This is the most I could show you. And they've never been used as a weapon.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you, Ed.
Oh, we finished?
No, sorry. Well, you want to go on?
No, I didn't. I just, the hour flew, you know.
You guys keep chatting. I'm going to get some photographs.
Okay.
We can keep rolling.
You mentioned, we'll keep chatting. You mentioned it was a 7-day-a-week job.
Yeah.
It's not like you had much time off. I mean,
well, no, because what else were you going to do anyway? You wanted to get the job done faster, so you got back for a couple days for the next assignment. I wanted to get back and read all the newspapers. I mean, that was all to, and
so you weren't hitting bars in Saigon or anything like that. You were going back to your.
I can remember one time ever, and I don't know when it was within the year. It had to be in the first part of the year. Somehow I connected with someone who was on active duty from Duquesne. I don't think he was an officer. I don't think he was a 4-year ROTC guy. But he had run at Duquesne the foreign films that we saw on campus, the Ingmar Bergmans and the Fellinis, and every 2 weeks on Friday afternoon, we could go into a classroom, and watch a 16 millimeter copy of Hiroshima Mon Amour, or Last Year at Marienbad, or The Seventh Seal or something. And this guy's name was Vincent Tammy. And somehow I connected with him over there, and he was in Saigon, and I managed to get there to have a beer with him in some club. And the main thing I remember about that afternoon was they had a jukebox like none I'd ever seen before or since. If you put on a record, and I remember it was Acker Bilk's Stranger on the Shore, a movie would pop up. I don't know whether it was visible on the disc or maybe a little screen behind the disc, but if you stood at the jukebox, you could watch this 3-minute scene enacted that fit the song. And I was fascinated by that because we had no such thing as home video or laser discs or Selectavision or anything like that. And that's what it was. In effect, it was like what we're later to call RCA Selectavision, where you put something on and the image popped up off the phonograph record. So.
Wow. And so your main entertainment was going back to did you call it a hooch? Your hooch?
Yeah, hooch. Thank you for that word. I'd forgotten that.
And reading Pittsburgh presses that you had.
Yeah.
It's kind of like you were following the war and following life back home.
Yeah.
Just.
Wow. And every now and then, I mean, you know, people whose careers I'd already followed for the first 22 years of my life were dying. I remember Walt Disney died when I was over there. And you know, there I had the information. Nobody else was getting newspapers. It was just me, but I wanted to know what was going on.
I picture you as trying to.
And I was a big pirate fan too. I wanted.
So you were following the pirates?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was going to say I was picturing you trying to get on Stars and Stripes or something like that, but that was never, of course, a possibility.
Oh.
You had a lot of responsibilities with what you were doing. You weren't doing any writing or
that
reviewing.
would have been a perfect fit.
Yeah, that would have been a perfect fit.
But that didn't happen. So it's all right.
Did you ever run across any Stars and Stripes guys there? Any newspaper people there?
No.
No?
Never.
Okay.
One time, Bob Hope was going to be in the general area, but it was such a distance that it was inaccessible to anyone in my unit. I never saw a show the whole time I was over there. And, you know, we didn't think about it. It just didn't happen. You're because you're living this 24/7 all the time and all the time, the rest of the world kind of evaporated. It wasn't quite real. I remember that you know, I had a girlfriend at the time who wrote a lot of letters, and I was writing back whenever I could, except I couldn't get them out, but once every 2 or 3 weeks. But I remember thinking there were a bunch of guys I'd gone through college with who did not do any military service. And every now and then I'd get a letter that said, "Oh, I'm so busy, you know, we're doing this and that." And I'd think, "Kid, you have no idea." And I think that fit fairly well with what happened when I came back, because it was so remote, nobody had any sense of what was going on. You didn't get it from the 6:30 network news. You know, that's just stats and headlines. It's not really what's happening from minute to minute and what it feels like to be over there. I never saw any news account that reflected that at all.
Isn't that amazing? For as much as that war was covered,
Yeah.
you're saying the real war wasn't really covered.
Well,
Kind of a macro.
what I was
bird's eye.
experiencing was not the war, but and I don't mean this in any disrespectful way to anyone or to the war effort, but for me it played more like a 2-year inconvenience at the service of the government and the people. It did not play out as a war, because I never fired a weapon the whole time I was over there, unless maybe we had a little bit of range practice or something, but that was not my experience of being in Vietnam. So that much more how inappropriate all this protesting, it just didn't make any sense to me at any level.
It's amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much.